late 20th century. A program responsive to the needs and aspirations of the working class majority, in particular the white working class majority of the country. Their failure was accompanied by a triumph of conservative statecraft. And the essence of this conservative statecraft, seizing the opportunity provided by the failure of the progressives, was successfully to combine material concessions to the interests of the moneyed classes with immaterial concessions to the anxieties of the moneyless classes. In this programmatic vacuum, this vacuum of the produced by the failure of the progressives, of the American progressives, to develop politically and conceptually a sequel to Roosevelt's program, a large part of the space was occupied by divisive or so-called wedge issues, which helped further to inhibit the political construction of a majoritarian coalition in favor of progressive reform in the United States. The first set of these divisive or wedge issues were issues having to do with the relation between race and class. The integrationist orthodoxy in the United States conceived the relation between race and class in such a way that race was treated as a threshold issue separate from class. And the result were a series of policies that not only failed to improve the situation of the black underclass, but alienated the white working class of the country from the progressive base. The second set of divisive or wedge issues had to do with the so-called moral agenda, exemplified by the signature issue of abortion, the counterpart to the issue of prohibition 100 years earlier, in which, once again, the progressives embraced, as a matter of federal authority and constitutional law, a position unacceptable to a large part of the working class majority of the country. But these divisive or wedge issues only aggravated a problem that was created before them. The underlying problem was the failure to establish a project capable of redressing or reversing the large forces of inequality and exclusion arising from the hierarchical segmentation of the economy. The two major traditions of reform in American history seem inadequate to this task. There are two traditions of reform in American history, of progressive reform. The first is the tradition of defense, of small business against big business, of small property against large wealth. This is the tradition that goes from Jefferson through Brandeis. And the second is the tradition of acceptance of strong authority of the national government to accept big business and large wealth, but to regulate them under the powers of the national government. And this is the tradition that was most clearly exemplified by the progressivism of the early 20th century in the United States. Both of these traditions seem inadequate because neither of them proposes or understands any way to reshape the market economy in its institutional content. And through this reshaping to produce a decisive broadening of economic and educational opportunity. A broadening of economic and educational opportunity that would resist the forces of inequality and exclusion resulting from the hierarchical segmentation of the economy. There seems to be a common element in those two reform traditions that have prevailed in American history. The common element is what you might call institutional fetishism or institutional dogmatism. A salient feature of American public culture is the experimentalist impulse. Experiment about everything. Vast problems, according to this view, yield to the cumulative effects of small practical solutions. But strangely, the Americans make an exception for their institutions. They exempt their institutions from the reach of this experimentalist impulse. The institutions of the state and the institutions of the market economy. The most extreme example is the cult of the Constitution. The reinvention of a progressive project in the United States seems to require a lifting of this exemption accorded to the institutions against the experimentalist impulse. That's a view, a very summary view of how the predicament I described before manifests itself in the American circumstance. Would someone like to speak to this account? Yes.
How does the populist movement fit to that program?
Well, I don't know. It seems that it is closest in my distinction between the two reform traditions to the defense of the little against the big. But not always. It had rarely had institutional content. Is a protest against the control of the society by the privileged classes. For the most part, with an indefinite programmatic implication. So I'm not sure. On the whole, we have this problem, and not just in the United States, but in contemporary societies with respect to political life, that the political institutions have, for the most part, been designed to slow transformation down. So the American constitutional scheme, on one interpretation, combines a liberal principle of fragmentation of power with a conservative strategy of slowing politics down through the Madisonian system of checks and balances. And some version of this problem recurs throughout the world. The result is that in much of the world, we have a choice or an oscillation between an institutional politics that is anti-transformative and a transformative politics that is anti or extra-institutional, conducted through various forms of populist adventurism or Caesarism. And the response would be to break this dilemma by reimagining and redesigning the political institutions. For the most part, it seems that populism failed to do that in the United States or anywhere else. Shall I go on to Europe, my second example? Yes.
Just a remark on the New Deal. So it seems that Roosevelt's plan is much more as following the same path that we have been going through. It seems that it's much more a reaction to the economic crisis that took place back then than actually as an autonomous project. So the same argument follows in the sense that in the American history, there's no crisis that came after the financial collapse from the 1930s that could justify a project that could fulfill the institutional program that could be developed theoretically in the U.S. So it seems that the same argument depends on the historic conditions for a program to go forward.
Undoubtedly, the opportunity for the New Deal program was this great crisis of depression and war. But the opportunity doesn't predetermine the response. There was a response. So one very schematic view of what happened or failed to happen in the New Deal is this. The early New Deal, before the recrudescence of the Depression in 1937, 1938, there's a broad range of institutional experiments, almost all of which failed or were rejected. Some of them were invalidated by the Supreme Court. The lasting residue of those experiments, the element that survived, were a series of measures designed to protect the individual against the extremes of economic insecurity, such as Social Security. Then, in the war, or even before it, this experimentalist impulse was abandoned and replaced by another direction, which was the popularization of consumption opportunities, achieved in the development of a market in mass consumption goods, but with abandonment of the attempt to reshape the market economy in the service of broader opportunity. not broader opportunity, just greater